Chances are you've never been in a life or death situation, let alone found yourself stuck in an apartment with the high risk of being shot by a major heroin dealer. If you have, I'd love to hear about it. If not, stick around, because it makes one hell of a good story. Hey guys, welcome to Bent Planet, where I tell you true tales of humans in abnormal predicaments. Tales that will twist your mind. And this story is no exception. All right, get comfortable. Are you ready to hear a story? In the city of Melbourne, Australia, in the late 80s, early 90s, wars between rival drug gangs was at an all-time high. Bodies were stacking up, and there were a lot of operations underway involving police infiltrating these gangs and gathering information on the criminals involved. One of those cops was a man we will call Darcy. He was happy to have an interview with me, but he would prefer to remain anonymous. So Darcy was working for a police agency when they gathered some information through an informer about a major heroin dealer. It was a solid lead, so they decided to introduce an undercover operative to get close to him, gather information on him, and slowly build a case against him. So Darcy was the man, and he was quickly introduced to this drug dealer through a third party. Now, the process for setting up a major bust like this does take some serious time. It would be easy to assume that drug dealers just want to make some big money off fast deals. But in general, just like in normal business, they need to know that they can trust the people they're working with, and so relationships have to be built on both sides. So for the sake of anonymity, we will call the dealer Shane. And once Darcy was introduced to Shane, they set about establishing this friendship and this working relationship. Nobody wanted to come off as desperate, so there was plenty of time for barbecues, bars, social hangouts, slowly building that relationship and making sure there were absolutely no red flags before a major deal took place. It's also standard practice to procure a small amount of drugs in this period. And what that does is two things. One, trust is established with the dealer because a sale is made without any interference or any problems going down. And two, the police then get to analyze the drugs. The more pure the product, the higher up the chain of command their dealer is. This is because each time drugs are sold, the next seller wants to further increase his profits for margin by increasing the volume of the drugs. So to do this, they will cut up the drugs with all sorts of other substances so that they have a larger volume of product to sell. As you can imagine, this also leads to a lot of overdoses and adverse reactions to the drugs, because who knows what they cut up with, and the illegal world isn't exactly following strict standards on health protocols. So after Darcy made this initial deal with Shane, more trust was established, and the police then knew that they had a major dealer on their hands. And something else happened in this friendship building stage with Shane that was quite unexpected. Another police agency was already investigating a shooting that took place in a nightclub where the singer of a stage show was wounded, and the suspect was none other than Shane. When they looked into his file, they noticed that he was already being watched by other police in a completely different investigation. So after making contact with those police, they were informed that an undercover cop was already working closely with their suspect. So although they couldn't be told exactly who that was, as they didn't want to expose Darcy, they were told that this undercover police operative could assist in gathering information on Shane's involvement in the nightclub shooting. So shortly after this is decided, Shane and Darcy decide to catch up for a friendly lunch. And when Darcy asks Shane what he's been up to, he tells him that while he was out on the weekend, hanging out with a crew in a nightclub, he was completely wasted off his chops on drugs and booze, and he had a gun on him and he wanted to show off, so he pulled the gun out at the table and, being a complete nutbag, pointed at the stage and fired a shot. So Darcy reacted as any good Australian mate would, told him he was a complete knob jockey and what the hell was he thinking. Shane didn't hide the fact that it was a stupid thing to do, and he said to Darcy, "Man, I know, but I need you to do one favour for me. Can you get rid of the gun for me?" Darcy asks, "Well, where's the gun?" And Shane tells him it's in the car around the corner. So at this point, Darcy is just thinking, damn, this is a double win. Not only has he given a complete admission, now he's going to hand over the actual firearm that was used, covered in his fingerprints. He asked Shane how he came about getting the gun, and Shane just said, "Oh, look, I've got plenty of guns. That's not a problem." So Darcy takes the gun, hands it over to the other detectives and tells Shane he threw it in the river. Then the detectives were told to hold back on any arrests so that the whole drug operation could go ahead as planned. So about a week later, it was organised that Darcy would meet Shane's drug suppliers and they would organise the sale of a large amount of heroin. This was the deal they had been waiting for. Now, undercover work like this has a huge amount of support in the background, and meetings like this are taken very seriously. Lots of provisions are set in place in case anything goes wrong. The risk level in this case was considered very high, considering Shane's access to firearms and his loose nature in using them. And overall, plenty of things can go wrong. Not just because you're working undercover and you could possibly slip up in your act and be exposed, but also because you could play the part too well, and the people you're working with may see an opportunity to make money in other ways, such as killing you and stealing the money. It's not the most ethical of businesses. So in this instance, a special operations or SWAT team was organised to be watching the meeting, with Darcy wearing recording devices to capture evidence of the whole arrangement, and also transmitting devices so that everything being said could easily be heard by the backup team for Darcy. In a situation like this, they will decide on using a particular hand signal, which means shoot to kill. So if Darcy feels threatened or feels like his life is suddenly in danger, he can just use this hand signal, and it's literally like pulling the trigger of a gun himself. And there's also safety words to use in case you have trouble using your hands for any reason. Now, because the snipers are usually situated at a great distance away, the meeting is usually organised in an area where they can still see clearly without being seen themselves. Generally an outdoor area that allows them to operate easily, free of the general public to avoid any innocent victims, and free of obstructions from sight. So on the day of the meeting, Darcy arrived on time at the designated meeting space. It was a huge big car park opposite a beach, but one that wasn't really used by the public, so there was no one else around, and it was not a high traffic area. So snipers were set up in place and a backup team was situated, ready to listen in on the whole conversation. But after a decent amount of waiting around, Shane doesn't show up. And eventually, Darcy gets a phone call from Shane telling him that the meeting place has to change and Darcy needs to come to his place in an apartment complex some distance away. With everything that was already set in place, of course Darcy tried to convince him to stick with the original arrangement and come and meet him where he was. But at the end of the day, you can only argue so much before you start raising alarm bells yourself. And generally, in a situation like this, it really comes down to the undercover operative, if they feel comfortable going ahead with the deal, and whether they feel they can handle the situation changing as it did. And in this instance, Darcy didn't feel like there was too much concern about raising the level of environmental risk. He was comfortable with the stability of trust that was already established, and essentially he and Shane were partners in this situation because Shane was the middleman introducing Darcy to his much bigger suppliers, forging a deal, and Shane too would be making a lot of money out of this situation. On top of that, this meeting was organising the deal, so the drugs wouldn't actually be there and Darcy wasn't carrying any money, so there was no risk of being killed to have the money stolen. So Darcy puts his faith in his gut along with his backup crew. At least they've heard through the phone surveillance where he's going. They will follow and they will be listening in on any conversations he has, and despite the fact that there won't be any snipers in place to protect him, he just doesn't feel like he's walking into a dangerous enough situation to warrant any true fear. So when he gets to Shane's, a big old housing commission complex, he walks into Shane's apartment, but then Shane immediately turns around, closes the door, locks it, turns back towards him and says, "Mate, I'm gonna need to search you." Boom. This was the last thing that Darcy expected, and the worst case scenario considering what was underneath his clothes. Pushed into both of Darcy's socks down the back of his ankles near his shoes were 2 battery packs, about the size of 2 AA batteries each. From those, wires ran all the way up the back of his legs to his waist, where he had microphones taped to the inside of his hips. And this was only covered by a loose-fitting pair of tracksuit pants. Some classic Aussie, no fucks given, bogan streetwear right there. He also had another battery at the base of his shirt with a wire running up through the buttons to where he had another microphone pinned to the inside of his collar. In his defense, Darcy immediately shot back and started yelling at Shane, "What are you talking about, man? We're mates. Since when do you have to search me?" But Shane remained persistent, telling Darcy that he'd been instructed by his suppliers to make sure he strip searched him just in case he was an undercover. "I fucking got rid of a gun for you, man," Darcy was saying, but Shane didn't care. "Let's just get this done, take your shirt off." So at this point, Darcy is acutely aware that Shane loves his guns and he's probably got one on him. Not only that, Darcy doesn't know where the other suppliers are. They could be anywhere in the apartment right now, aiming a gun sight directly at his head, waiting to see what happened with the strip search. After all, he was the one that was called to the apartment, and it was far beyond the initial meeting time. Darcy knows that he is in a super dangerous position right now. At this moment, you probably think, why doesn't Darcy just pull out the safety word? He knows he's got a whole SWAT team backing him up, listening into the conversation, and he just needs to say the word. They'll burst in and save the day. But remember too, he's spent months working on this case, and he's not the only one. He might be the undercover operative, but there are loads of guys that have been working on this case in the background leading up to this bust. A good chunk of his life has been spent preparing for this moment, with the aim of taking down a huge heroin operation. If he calls in the big guns now, they've got nothing. No evidence, no drugs, no arrest, no big bust. So despite being aware that he could be seconds away from losing his own life, he still wasn't ready to give up that case. And he was also hoping that the SWAT team, who were listening into the conversation, weren't about to burst in thinking he was in danger and put the whole case in jeopardy anyway. So at this point, Shane is just getting angry at the whole situation, so he just starts leaning in to give Darcy a pat down and check him for any wires. Darcy had to do something. He'd either have to rely on his fists to beat Shane down the moment he touched a wire, or somehow distract Shane from finding anything at all. Shane yelled at him to take his shirt off. So instead of fumbling with the buttons and exposing the wire, Darcy just rips the whole shirt open and exposes his chest, pulling the wires to the side and the device out of view, and just yells, "There, you happy?" So at this point, Shane is agitated and pissed off at the argument and just tells him, "All right, now pull your pants down." So in a moment of staying in true character and drawing on all the testosterone and egotistical, homophobic attitudes that ran rife through the underworld, Darcy takes his thumbs, shoves them down the inside of his tracksuit pants, and pushes them down to expose his genitals, yelling, "There you go, you want to see my cock, huh? Is that what you want? You want to look at my cock?" But at the same time, his hands on either side are covering up the microphones on his hips from Shane's view. This sudden snap and aggressive sexual accusation completely throws Shane. And although he's already moved in for the pat down, he balks and says, "All right, mate, settle down, and then reaches out and gives Darcy this completely useless pat down the sides of his legs, his hands completely missing the battery packs and the wires that are running up the backs of Darcy's legs just millimeters from his fingertips. He clearly felt uncomfortable and didn't want to be in a position at all where he's feeling his mate's body and wanted this to be over as quickly as possible. Darcy unclenches his fists and relaxes and knows that he just dodged a bullet. The meeting would still be on, the deal would still be organised, and the bust would still take place. Later, when the whole meeting was over and Darcy met up with his SWAT commander, he made a comment to him about how close that was, and he was surprised that the SWAT team hadn't burst in, considering how close he had come to being exposed. And it was then that the commander told him, well, actually, due to the building materials used in that old apartment complex, and because of the position of the apartment, we lost all signals and had zero communication the entire time you were in there. So in fact, Darcy was completely on his own, armed with nothing but his quick wit. Alright guys, thanks for tuning in. If you dug the story, hit the like button. To hear more about the bust itself and another incident that took place while it was going down, I've created another video called Dodging Bullets Part 2, The Bust. Also, if you'd like to hear the whole story straight from the source, I've uploaded the full interview with Darcy, and it's a compelling look into life as an undercover cop. So check that out. Both links are in the description. Hit the comments below and tell me if you've ever been in a situation where you felt like death could be imminent. I'd love to hear about it. That's it from me, signing off. Until the next story, catch you later.